Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Today we're finally getting into discussing the second half of the Civil War. And in this particular presentation, we're going to focus a little bit more on some of the more internal struggles going on in the Union side and in the Confederate side that end up eroding support from within and causing the ultimate outcome of the war. Now, in July of 1862, Congress passes what it calls the Militia Act. Okay? And this is a major step forward in terms of equal representation under the law, especially in the Union eyes, because this authorizes the Army to use freed slaves as laborers or soldiers. Now, Lincoln does not immediately endorse the idea of using black soldiers because he's worried that the border states, right, the states that we originally saw in blue, right, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, that these states were going to somehow decide to go over to the Confederate side. Okay, so he's worried about losing support by doing this. Okay, he's already had a lot of backlash from the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's only after the Emancipation Proclamation is done that he chooses to do this. So, May 22nd of 1863, the U.S. War Department creates the Bureau of Colored Troops. Okay, so this is the first actual government entity that oversees the recruitment and, again, the oversight of colored soldiers. And more than 180,000 African Americans end up enlisting in the Union side. 80% of them, too, come from southern states. Okay, so this seems to point to the fact that many of these individuals are out for a bit of revenge, as you can imagine. 38,000 of them end up giving their lives in the process, too. Blacks end up accounting for about 1/4 of all naval recruits as well, and an estimated over 2,800 black sailors end up dying in the process. And in the North, a significant amount of racism ends up influencing the status of blacks when it comes to serving. Okay? Again, just because Northerners are opposed to slavery as an institution doesn't mean that they are in favor of racial equality. And several instances, in most instances, black soldiers and sailors are placed under white command. And unfortunately, many of these white officers are not entirely given over to ideas of equality. Okay, they end up very heavily abusing black soldiers in many cases. And there's plenty of systemic racism that goes into this as well. Okay, black soldiers are paid $7 a month, and white soldiers are paid $16 a month. Okay, so this is already from the get-go set in the state of inequality. And they're also considered ineligible for enlistment bonuses. Okay, so if they voluntarily enlist, they're not given the bonus that whites are given. The role of women in the war is another thing that gets overlooked quite a bit. Okay? Particularly in the North, women take a very active role in the conflict. They end up stepping into a lot of traditionally male-dominated roles, and this is a precedent that is set really for future conflicts, specifically the two world wars that we end up encountering in the 20th century. Okay? So they end up going to work in mills, factories, in mines in some cases. They sew uniforms. They raise money, provide supplies, compose poems and songs to boost morale. And 20,000 Northern women serve as nurses and in the health industry. Okay? And this is the primary area where women tend to gravitate toward. One individual named Clara Barton ends up being a very major groundbreaking nurse. She goes on to found the American Red Cross. Dorothy Dix, who we've already discussed as being a proponent of mental health overhaul, okay, becomes more famous during this period for the same reasons. And Mary Edwards Walker becomes the only woman to ever receive the Congressional Medal of Honor because she is a spy for the Union. Okay? And women are constantly used as spies because they are typically overlooked, especially by the Confederacy. Remember, the Confederacy doesn't view women as being citizens, right? They are treated as second and third class citizens, even though, again, they're not citizens. And many Southern communities during this time period are essentially made up of white women, children, and slaves, right? Again, 80% of the men in the South have gone off to fight in the war, okay? And so a lot of the Southern women and the children and slaves in particular are all left in a state of prolonged poverty, okay? Because again, there's no one there to oversee production, there's no one there to take things to market, the markets have essentially shut down, okay? And cotton in particular has taken a sharp nosedive because the Confederacy has gone downhill, okay? The Union Army has taken control of the Mississippi Valley, and again, the Mississippi River in particular ends up being taken over in time. And so the women are left to run the plantations. Okay? Some of them choose to become clerks, school teachers, to make money somehow so they can end up supporting themselves and their families. And again, some go so far as to even disguise themselves as men to fight in the war. Okay? And others, like Mary Edwards Walker, choose to serve as spies. And the remainder, those who are typically in a more impoverished state, become camp followers. They act as cooks, letter writers, makeshift nurses, laundresses, and some even go as far as prostitution. Now, the congressional Republicans at this point are the ones who are still make up the majority when it comes to Congress. Okay? And they believe that the federal government is going to be able to benefit from the country promoting economic development. Okay? So if they can promote that during the course of the war here, right, it could be something that is long-lasting, right, something that could end up lasting after the war ends, right? They're already looking toward the end of the war, okay, not just in the moment. So the Morrill Tariff is passed in 1862. This raises more government revenue and protects American industry from foreign competition, okay? So it raises tariffs and allows American industry to continue. The Pacific Railway Act provides more federal funding and grants for a transcontinental railroad, right? This stretches from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California, okay, 1,900 miles. The Homestead Act of the same year grants 160 acres of public land to every settler willing to work the land for 5 years. Okay, this is what spurs a lot more westward expansion, especially after the Civil War. And it also creates the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The Morrill Land Grant Act provides the states with 30,000 acres of federal land to establish public universities. Okay, and these universities teach the agricultural and mechanical arts. Okay, so this is where we get A&M universities. And the National Banking Act creates national banks, okay, to issue paper money that is going to be accepted nationwide. Okay, again, this is supposed to, instead of having one single Bank of the United States like we've seen 2 times in the past, we now have multiple national banks to kind of spread out economic stability. Okay, so all of these put together end up stabilizing the country quite a bit from this point going forward. Now, when it comes to the finances of the country, the organization of the Union in particular is what leads to the Union being so stable. Okay? In December of 1860, the federal treasury is virtually empty. Okay, and so Congress has 3 different options at this point. It can raise taxes, it can print paper money, or it can sell government bonds to investors. Okay, similar to what Alexander Hamilton attempted to do in order to stabilize the country after the American Revolution. So, in 1862, Congress creates everyone's favorite government entity, okay, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, okay, and this collects the very first income tax in the country. Okay. It's a 3% tax on all annual incomes more than $800. It's a 5% tax on all annual incomes more than $10,000, okay? And only 250,000 people out of 39 million Americans total have a high enough income to pay taxes. So most people don't have to pay taxes at this point. But this only meets about 21% of all expenditures. Okay, so this is a relatively small drop in the bucket compared to what is needed. In 1862, Congress begins approving paper money. These are known as greenbacks. Okay? Greenbacks are the first U.S. dollar bill, like what you see up here at the top right. Okay? So this is the Legal Tender Act in 1862. Right? $450 million of paper money is printed out of this. Okay? And the largest percentage of what ends up amounting to government expenditures is raised in $2 billion of government bonds being sold. So basically, more and more people are investing in the Union than anything else. Confederacy, meanwhile, is a complete mess when it comes to its finances. Okay, it's extremely disorganized. It has no long-term plan. And Jefferson Davis is forced to create a treasury and a revenue collecting agency from scratch. Okay, so all of the government entities that have been in existence on the Union side since the country was formed have to be created all over again for the South. Okay, so the South is very much in the same type of position that the Union was in once the Revolutionary War ended. And even though the South's economy is very land rich, it is cash poor. Okay, so all of the wealth is basically buried in the plantations and the amount of wealth that is used to to accrue wealth in the South. Right, all the means of production is where the wealth lies. But there aren't really very many people living in the South who have safes full of cash. In other words. So it owns 30% of the nation's assets, but only about 12% of its currency. And in 1861, the Confederacy starts its own property tax, okay, and this is supposed to be collected by the states, okay, and of course it's very easy to dodge this, okay, it leads to absolute chaos. 2 years later, the Confederate Congress starts taxing everything, okay, and it becomes very, very easy to evade taxes, okay, enforcement is extremely poor and very disorganized again. And taxes only cover about 5% of the Confederate war costs. Okay? Again, by comparison, the IRS meets about 21% of the Union's costs. Bonds are only about 33%. Okay, so very few people living in the South have a lot of faith in the Confederacy to endure. And more than $1 billion in paper money is issued by the Confederacy in a similar way to what we see happen in the North. But again, the money ends up being worthless in the longer term. And there's a major shortage of goods in the South as well. Okay, this causes prices to skyrocket, and there's a lot of riots that end up occurring here. Okay, a turkey is about $100 in 1864 in the South. Okay, a barrel of flour is $425, and a pound of bacon is $10. A major concern during wartime, beginning at this point, and again, setting a precedent going forward, is the concern around civil liberties, okay, and what the government can and cannot do to citizens during wartime. The militant abolitionists in Congress, the group known as the Radical Republicans in particular, are also beginning to look at Lincoln as being inadequate. Okay? And the Radical Republicans are the ones who end up taking control of the process of Reconstruction over time, okay? Especially after Lincoln is assassinated. And the desire for the Radical Republicans here is to reconstruct the South, quote unquote. Okay? And they want to basically enact some sort of poetic justice here. They want to allow all Union soldiers to seize plantations and redistribute them to all the freed slaves, okay, to basically seize all the wealth and give it back to individuals as reparations. Okay? And if they had had their way, this would have been the actual source of slavery reparations. The Democrats, meanwhile, have been completely decimated by the Southern Whigs. Okay, right? They end up going to the Confederacy, and Stephen Douglas dies in the meantime as well. Okay, so their leadership has begun to erode significantly. And there are several different forms of Democrats living in the South at this point, and all over the country for that matter. You have individuals called peace Democrats. Okay, these are individuals who want to restore the Union as it was. Okay, they support Lincoln's war policies, but very reluctantly. Okay, and they don't like the idea of economic legislation being taken over by the Republicans. War Democrats are limited to Lincoln's policies only, and Copperhead Democrats are open sympathizers with the Confederacy. They hate Lincoln and they want the war to end and slavery to be protected. Okay? So again, if you live in the South, you're familiar with what a copperhead is, right? This is a highly venomous snake. And Lincoln starts to use emergency powers during the war and restricting civil liberties, right? Kind of, calling into existence what many people begin to fear. Okay? He suspends the act of habeas corpus. Okay, this basically says you don't have the right to a speedy hearing before a judge after you're arrested. Okay, you have to wait in confinement before this is given to you. And the Habeas Corpus Act in 1863 in particular allows Lincoln to arrest people on suspicion of treason. Okay, so this is, again, something where if someone accuses you of treason, you can very easily lose your freedom. Now, returning back to the battles here, in spring of 1863, Lincoln finally appoints Ulysses S. Grant as the commanding general in the West. Okay? He puts him in charge of all Western forces. And after the disaster that we've had at Fredericksburg, where Ambrose Burnside ends up going into retreat, Lincoln appoints General Joseph Hooker to lead the Army of the Potomac instead. So, May of 1863, the Army of the Potomac has ballooned up a little bit to 130,000 men. Okay, and again, it goes down the Potomac River and ends up failing under Hooker at Chancellorsville. Okay, so it's gone down here from the capital into Chancellorsville, where the Confederacy has won. Robert E. Lee splits his army into thirds, has attacked Hooker's exposed right flank, and we have days and days of confusion here that ultimately cause Hooker to go into retreat. Grant, meanwhile, has moved his forces down into Vicksburg, Mississippi. Okay, so we go all the way down on the western side here. And this is the only rail and river junction that exists between Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans. Okay, so this is a major strategic location for Grant to take over. Okay, and if Union forces are managed to gain control of the Mississippi River, then they can enact the third branch of the Anaconda Plan, right, to split the Confederacy in two and strangle its supply lines. So Grant and the Union forces dig 12 miles of trenches around the city, and they lay siege to it for several weeks. And meanwhile, the Confederate forces that are trapped inside the city are starving to death. Okay, this is the major feature of any kind of siege tactics. Okay, if you are a member of a group that is being besieged, right, you have no supplies coming in, and you typically will starve to death, or disease will run rampant as well. In June of 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia moves northward. Okay, has thousands of animals, wagons, and slaves in its retinue. Okay, and along the way, right, there are several animals and free blacks that are actually seized by the Army of Northern Virginia. Okay, this is the Confederate branch. And the Confederate General Jeb Stuart here threatens to attack Washington, D.C. Okay, he is moving very aggressively northward into Virginia. And on June 30th, we get the most famous battle of the Civil War. Okay, the Confederates and Union forces end up surprising one another in Pennsylvania at Gettysburg. July 1st, we have 65,000 Confederates and 85,000 Union soldiers fighting against one another in the largest battle ever fought on American soil. And this is a prolonged battle. Okay, it ends up lasting for several days. Okay? Union soldiers retreat, regroup on surrounding ridges, and launch another attack. On July 3rd, Lee decides he's going to assault Union forces at Cemetery Ridge and gets into a cannon bombardment. Okay? Union forces are stationed on Cemetery Ridge, firing cannons downward at 12,500 Confederates. Okay? And to top it all off, it's 90 degrees outside at this point. Okay? There are 120 Union cannons firing on the Confederates. 42,000 men are killed, wounded, or missing in the process, and thousands of horses are killed as well. And Lee is forced to retreat into Virginia, while meanwhile the Unions fails to give chase. Okay, so again, this is another very infuriating situation where if the Union forces had given chase, again, the war might have turned out a little bit different. On July 4th, the Confederate commander at Vicksburg ends up surrendering at last. Okay, so 30,000 men end up surrendering and ends a 47-day siege. Okay, so this is a very prolonged siege. And suddenly, right, with the surrender of Vicksburg, the Union forces have managed to cut off Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas from the Confederacy. And the northern states end up funding a military cemetery at Gettysburg in order to honor the fallen. Okay, so November 19th is when we get Lincoln's very famous Gettysburg Address. This is where he expresses sorrow for the losses of those at the particular battle and laments the fact that he hasn't done more sooner. September 9th of 1863, William Rosecrans, who was a Union general, ends up taking Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he chases Braxton Bragg into Georgia, and they end up clashing again at Chickamauga. And Chickamauga does not actually appear on this map, but I believe it's on one of the border regions between Georgia and Tennessee. Union forces end up retreating to Chattanooga, which is still here on the map, right here at kind of the bottom left. And the Confederates surround Union forces. Okay. November 24th and 25th, Union reinforcements do arrive. They dislodge the Confederates from Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. And the Confederacy suddenly loses its grip in the West. And by 1864, the leaders of the Confederacy are suddenly very skeptical about achieving victory at all. Lincoln does achieve renomination for the presidency, and does the unthinkable here in that he actually selects a Democrat, again, to be his running mate, vice president, okay, in the form of War Democrat Andrew Johnson. Okay. And remember, a War Democrat is someone who only accepts his military policies. Okay? He doesn't really accept his economic policies. Okay? And they run on a national union ticket, okay? Basically saying that we're not going to divide politics here. We're going to unite the two political parties in the North, and we're going to run on a single ticket together. Okay, so again, this is an optimistic way of doing things, but in the long run, it does end up backfiring. The Democrats try to get Grant to oppose Lincoln on the ticket, okay, to no end, right? Grant says no. Okay, he ends up actually running on the Republican ticket much later. And they end up nominating George McClellan instead. Remember, McClellan is the one who was fired by Lincoln and put on recruitment duty. McClellan, meanwhile, seems to have gone turncoat. He pledges to end the war and allow the Confederacy to go in peace. Again, this was a man who was a former Union soldier, okay, a commanding officer no less, and suddenly he is willing to allow the Confederacy to continue to exist. Lincoln brings Grant to Washington and gives him the rank of lieutenant general, handing him the entire command of Union forces. So now Grant is made the official commander of all Union forces for the duration of the war. And Grant's strategy here is an extremely aggressive one. Okay, rather than trying to attack strategic cities in the South, he's going to attack Confederate forces wherever he finds them. Okay, so again, this becomes something of a war of attrition for the Confederacy. Okay, the Union decides it's going to attack its opponents wherever it finds them. So in the spring of 1864, the Union armies of Virginia, Tennessee, and Louisiana begin to launch very relentless offensives. Okay, so Grant is constantly giving chase now. Okay, we've upped our tactics here, where we're not hesitating anymore. And William Tecumseh Sherman is assigned to lead the Tennessee Army south into the heart of the Confederacy. Okay, Sherman's march to the sea becomes the aftermath of this. In May of 1864, the Army of the Potomac, which is now about 115,000 men, ends up moving south once again into Virginia. And on May the 5th and the 6th, Lee and Grant clash together at the Battle of the Wilderness. This is an area of very dense forest. And what happens here is, because these rifles are still using, again, gunpowder and flash whenever they do fire, right, quite often they throw a spark. Okay, and a lot of the forested region ends up catching fire because of this, and because of cannon fire as well. Okay, and the forest ends up catching fire and burning several soldiers alive in the process. Grant engages Lee again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. This is 11 miles southwest of Fredericksburg, okay, and lasts for 12 straight days. Grant tries to launch a coordinated attack at Cold Harbor. This is 10 miles east of Richmond, okay, very uncoordinated, unfortunately. And nearly 4,000 Union soldiers are killed or wounded in a crossfire. 2 months into Grant enacting this type of battle strategy, he's lost 60,000 Northern troops, and Lee has lost almost half that. And suddenly the Northerners are beginning to criticize Lincoln and Grant all over again. Okay, they're realizing that more and more soldiers are dying. The Confederacy is not losing as much. And Grant begins to maneuver forces around Lee into Petersburg, Virginia. Okay, this is 25 miles south of Richmond, where you see here. And he plans to lay siege to the Confederacy the same way that he did at Vicksburg. Right? He thinks that if he can flank the Confederacy and divide it again at Richmond, right, or at Petersburg, I beg your pardon, then he can eventually move into the area of Richmond and strangle the Confederacy and take their capital. The Union manages to hold the Confederacy in check for about 9 months as a direct result. From mid-July of 1864 going forward, Sherman's forces reached the outskirts of Atlanta, okay, in Georgia, and this is where they trapped 40,000 Confederate soldiers inside the city. Now, the general of the Confederacy at this point is Joseph Johnston. He's replaced by John Bell Hood, who had an arm shattered at Gettysburg and who lost a leg at Chickamauga as well. Okay, so John Bell Hood is actually in a pretty poor physical condition. In this particular photograph, I don't know if this was taken before or after what happened, but he, I believe, has a prosthetic limb here, the hand that he's holding, if I'm not mistaken. This is the arm that was shattered, and ends up losing a leg. So he actually has to be strapped to his saddle and secured in place by a leather belt in order to stay on his horse. And his forces attacked Sherman's forces 3 times over the course of 8 days. And Hood ends up losing 7 times as many soldiers as Sherman does in the process. Okay, so the Union actually does manage to retain its forces in this particular instance. By September, the Confederates have evacuated Atlanta, leaving it to Union forces all the way until November. 20,000 residents are commanded to leave Atlanta because the city is about to be burned. And that's what Sherman and his contingency proceeds to do. They burn all the railroads, the iron foundries, all of the shops, the mills, the businesses, the hotels, everything. And once Atlanta falls and the Union manages to secure Mobile and the Shenandoah Valley, suddenly people in the North start supporting Lincoln again. Okay, so again, there's a lot of back and forth when it comes to public sentiment about the war, specifically in the North. When the 1864 election comes around, McClellan only carries New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. Okay, Lincoln overwhelmingly wins. And Sherman continues to go through Georgia here. He loots and burns plantations along the way. He frees slaves, attempts to grant them control of plantations when and where he can. 40,000 slaves are freed in the process. All the railroads are destroyed. And by February 1st, Sherman turns north across the Savannah River into South Carolina. Okay, so right here, kind of in the center of the map where you see Savannah, is where he turns north. He burns over a dozen towns in the process along the way. And on February 17th, he and his Union forces capture the state capital of Columbia. Okay, so Georgia and South Carolina are now brought under the control of Union forces. And he orders 2 all-black regiments to lead the Union advance into Charleston. And again, this is a strategy similar to what we saw during the War of 1812, okay, where British forces had freed a certain number of slaves and had given them command in the army and had sent them as part of the vanguard. Again, this is using the greatest fears of the Confederacy against them. Okay? Again, a bit of poetic justice, but unfortunately also because these individuals were deemed to be collateral damage, right? Individuals that could be expendable. And Major Robert Anderson, the man who initially was forced to surrender Fort Sumter to the Confederacy at the start of the war, is given the honor of raising the Union flag once again after it is retaken by the Union. Now, the tea towel that you see at the top right here, the reason that I've got this on here, is this was the actual item that was used as a makeshift white flag of surrender by the Confederacy at the very end. From winter to spring of 1865, the Confederacy is suddenly besieged on all sides. Okay, the Union has managed to very aggressively push its way into the Deep South and is slowly beginning to, again, sandwich the Confederacy in. And Jefferson Davis is very adamant that he is not going to surrender, okay, even though many of the other Confederate officers are pleading with him to do so. On March 13th, he signs a Virginia bill calling for the immediate recruitment of black soldiers. This is a last-ditch effort by the Confederacy, a desperate one, to bolster their numbers. Okay, and they actually have to go so far as to ask permission from slave owners to borrow their slaves, right, their alleged property, to use them for army purposes. On March 4th, a few days before this, Lincoln delivers a second inaugural address. Okay, and about 100 yards away, John Wilkes Booth is listening. Okay, he's a 26-year-old actor who listens to Lincoln talk about peace. Okay, and John Wilkes Booth is the man ultimately responsible for assassinating Lincoln, as we know. On April 2nd, or 7th, that is, Grant sends a note urging Robert E. Lee to surrender, and knowing that Confederate forces are not going to be able to regroup. 2 days later, Robert E. Lee agrees to meet at Appomattox Courthouse and surrenders. And Grant does something here that is deemed to be an act of service and respect to Lee and his troops, and that he allows the Confederates to keep their pistols, their horses, and their mules if they surrender their rifles. And he ensures that none of them are going to be tried for treason. And once they do surrender their rifles, he orders that the Confederates be provided with a hot meal. Okay? So this is a strange level of compassion and, again, direct respect for Robert E. Lee on the part of Ulysses S. Grant. On May 10th, Jefferson Davis is finally captured by Union forces in Georgia after he leaves Richmond. And he is ultimately imprisoned for 2 years in Virginia. In the end, the Civil War is an extremely transformative one. Okay? The Union undergoes several widespread changes as it attempts to reabsorb the South back into it. For one thing, the Southern economy has been completely annihilated. Okay? Meanwhile, the Northern economy has gone through an unprecedented boost. The balance of power in Congress is dramatically shifted, okay, from the South to the North, as well as in the Supreme Court and in the presidency. And it also ends up facilitating Western settlement over time. Okay, many of the projects that the North has begun to enact throughout the course of the Civil War end up bleeding over into the aftermath. And the federal government begins to expand at the expense of the states. Okay? And this is what causes the Confederacy, the former Confederacy at this point, to raise such a heavy level of protest about what has happened. Okay? And it's the reason why Southerners, unfortunately, even still today in some cases, attempt to refer to this as the War of Northern Aggression. Okay? It's a very misguided attempt to refer to the Confederacy as some sort of innocent bystander, okay, that they are somehow a conquered nation, okay, and really that was not the case. There is a large-scale production of preserved food after the war. Okay, this is when we start getting into the meat packing industry, to canning food. And a lot of federal contracts suddenly provide a lot of money to foster new means of production in the country. Okay? The iron, steel, and petroleum industries, along with the railroad industry, suddenly become these major booming assets. Okay? And this is where we get the first major corporations and the rise of the robber barons. And it's the first war to use modern advanced technology. Okay? We have ironclad ships being used for the first time. Repeating rifles, steam power, railroads, balloons are used for observation. Okay, we use all kinds of new modern technology. And the casualties are completely overwhelming. Okay, 1 in 12 men end up serving in the war, and over 750,000 soldiers died. Okay, this is comparable to 7.5 million soldiers dying by today's standards, okay, adjusted for the number of people living in the country. 37,000 black Union soldiers end up dying as well, okay? And 50,000 survivors return home with 1 or more limbs amputated, okay? This is before any kind of antiseptic methods are really being used, okay? So if you have a wound that becomes gangrenous, it's quite often going to either cost you your life or cost you your limb, okay, depending on what is readily available. And disease ends up killing approximately twice as many soldiers on an annual basis as battles do. Okay, so this is still a lesson that we haven't quite learned from the Mexican-American War, okay, where we lost more soldiers to disease, dysentery, and so forth than we did to battles. 50,000 civilians are killed as well. Okay, women, children, the elderly, right, slaves who didn't want any part of it. And nearly 4 million slaves are freed at the very end. Okay, by January of 1865, Missouri and Tennessee have effectively abolished slavery. And Lincoln convinces the House of Representatives to actually pass an amendment to the Constitution legitimizing the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay? And this is what ultimately becomes the 13th Amendment. Okay? What concretely establishes that the United States will no longer suffer slavery to exist. Okay? So on December 18th of 1865, Lincoln unfortunately does not live to see that the 13th Amendment becomes law.